It is a rainy day here in Calgary, Alberta, Treaty 7 lands. I'm Eric Freiberger. Welcome to another episode of the Well Dwellers podcast, where we journey deep beneath the surfaces of disability, dignity, and the hope in a shared community that explores the places where transformation begins and life endures. In today's episode, I'm joined by my friend Dr. Michael Morelli, Assistant Professor of Theology, Culture, and Ethics at Northwest Seminary and College in beautiful British Columbia, Canada. Michael brings a great depth of thought shaped by his work in theological ethics and cultural experience, particularly within the disabled community he is a part of. But what makes this conversation so rich is how personal and reflective he becomes while sharing his own story and history with disability. Together, we dive into the metaphors, influences, and lived experiences that have shaped our lives and communal initiatives. We talk candidly about the struggles of building inclusive communities in our world marked by trauma, diverse differences, ableism, and the isolating forces of idealized individualism. And we wrestle with the tensions of discomfort in discipleship and what it means to truly be present with our bodies, with each other, and with the language we use to connect and make sense of it all. I was personally deeply touched and encouraged by Michael Morelli's and my conversation. Many of the things he shared seem to speak directly to my heart and bring meaning to a lot of the things that I too am pursuing and trying to do here at the bottom of the well. And I am truly thankful for that. But I also really hope that our conversation is encouraging and inspires you. If it does, and you think of others that need to hear our talk today, please do share this episode with others wherever you like. Please give a thumbs up, a like on today's episode, and write a review on whatever podcast platform you are listening or watching this from. If you are watching from the YouTube channel, you will know and notice that I put quite a few gems in the midst of our talk today. And I'm hoping they're entertaining, but also perhaps inspiring and insightful for you to see as part of today's episode. Visit at thebottomofthewell.com and subscribe to keep up with the latest episodes. And thank you for listening today. Today is definitely a conversation about faith formation and the messy, beautiful work of being human together. So let's settle in, let's dwell together and connect with the deeper meanings we find in Michael Morelli's and my conversation. Well, hey, Michael Morelli, it's been great getting to chat with you behind the scenes here. Thank you for joining me here on the Well Dwellers podcast. I'm excited for our talk today, and I am here in Calgary in Treaty 7 lands, and I would like to just start maybe by opening the well for you to kind of introduce yourself and where you're from and a little bit of your backstory.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Eric. It's been wonderful getting to know you and working with you on the Deeper Communion projects. I'll use that in the plural because there's always something going on with Deeper Communion.
Mm.
And yeah, what you're doing on this podcast, I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to be here. I'll start with what most people start with, and then I'll get into the more personal stuff, when you introduce yourself. So I currently work at a school here in Langley, British Columbia. It's called Northwest College and Seminary. It is part of ACT Seminaries, which is an affiliate of Trinity Western University. I've been here For almost 6 years, I'm associate professor of theology and ethics, and I also manage our lifelong learning. So that gives you a little bit of idea about what I do for work. More personally, I've been married for over 10 years. I have two boys, 8 and 5. So things are pretty full on in my life right now. When I have spare time, what do I do? I, I, I like to read. I like art, anything to do with art, music, film, TV.
Mm.
I'm not gifted in any way in the visual arts side of things. I envy people who are. So I mean, I love going to galleries. I love, just immersing myself in the creative world. I definitely am a creative type. Um, there's probably more that I can share, but I'll stop there with that brief introduction.
Well, hey, that's awesome. I think all of us have a bit of creativity and artistry at heart. And I
Hmm.
would say you are a filmmaker because you do your own podcast
Yeah.
where you do video with that as well. So you and I are maybe kind of the same lines of filmmaking in the podcast industry.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I went through a phase in my life quite a while back where I was very active online in media and communications, and I kind of had my fill of it. I just kind of went off the grid. And a lot of the creative things that I did were very under the radar, and I was very not opposed to, but I just kind of avoided putting anything out there in the social media world. But more recently in my work, taking on a lifelong learning position, and what that looks like very practically is offering education, experiences, resources, all that sort of stuff for people who want to learn and grow, but don't necessarily want to do a degree. Right. And so one of the things that I realized is if that's the case, then you probably should be a little bit more outward facing than the typical academic tends to be when it's you just kind of focus on the programs and you're like, just come to us. I realized that in order to engage people beyond, just this immediate sphere of coming to do a undergrad or graduate degree,
Mm.
I need to start some conversations and show people just this world that maybe they aren't very familiar with. And so that led me into the YouTube and the podcasting world, and I'm still figuring it out. Like it's fun. It's a great excuse to have conversations like this, but I am by no means totally at ease in this world, but I'm willing to give it a go. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been podcasting for about 5, 6 years, and I think I'm still learning to do things too.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say I'm a professional or anything. I kind of resist. I'm no influencer, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't I mean, I think we can all have influence, and my ambitions there is hopefully, the conversations that I'm inviting people to participate in directly or indirectly, uh, are influential. But I think the way in which folks like you and I are trying to stage the conversation, it I don't think the big companies are lining up to, hey, can we send you our product to do a an ad placement on this. I mean, if anybody wants me to try out their book, or I don't know, like send me something, I'll but I just don't think that that's what you and I are inspiring to be, and I find that refreshing.
No, no way. You know what really actually got me started with podcasting had bit to do with trying to digest some of the stuff I was learning and the stuff that I was involved with in community, but also many years ago. It's actually many years ago, and it's never left me. Was this experience where I met a local Unitarian here in Calgary for coffee in a local Starbucks, and we got into this really great conversation covering a range of different topics of our faith, our spirituality, and the history of our religious movements and traditions. And I really loved it. And it was actually several weeks after this that my wife Bonnie and I we went to see a movie, and this lady comes up to us and she says, "Hey, I don't think you know me, but I was actually in a Starbucks several weeks ago where you were having a conversation with another gentleman, and that was the most radical, awesome thing I have ever seen or heard before. And her sharing that with me and just reflecting on the power of sharing the community conversations we have and the impacts they can have made me realize that this podcast environment, this could be literally life changing for people that are beyond our own imaginations, beyond our own sense of awareness. It's kind of that work of the spirit that we're not even aware is going on.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. Um, every once in a while, if my students would tell you this, if you take a class with me, I say this often that every once in a while you're reminded that the small things you do matter. Um, and sometimes it's the big things you do, you're reminded that those matter. But every once in a while, God just brings a person into your life or persons into your life, and they talk to you about something that you did and how it changed the way they saw the world or encouraged them at a time when they were low or what have you. And sometimes it's just an email randomly, I read your book or whatever. And those are just encouragements, I think, from God to say that these little things matter, probably beyond what you can imagine, like you just said. And I also say you don't get those all the time, because I think if we got it all the time, then we'd start to think it was us that was the source of it and not the
Mhm.
spirit. And so you're totally right. The spirit takes what little things we do, medium-sized things we do, big-sized things we do, and works them in ways beyond what we can imagine and maybe we'll ever know. Until Jesus comes back and we're all in heaven and we get the full account of the effects that we had on people. Eternity is a long time, so we'll have some time to really, really hash out, those sorts of things. But I'm with you, and that's what keeps me going on the days where I ask myself, does this actually change anything? Does this have any effects? I'm just reminded of small things can grow into big things because that seems to be the way God does business.
Mhm. Yeah. Speaking of those small little things and moments that transform our lives, I know I planned on asking you this question, and before I push record, you said it might be the most difficult question to answer. But hey, let me hit you up with it. If you could name one of those small moments in your life that radically transformed your thought, shaped who you are, and was a significant moment, what would be one of those moments in your life?
Yeah, no, you're telling the truth there. Before we hit record, I did say that, you sent some questions just to help outline what we'd be talking about. And that question is the one that I've had to reflect on the most because a lot of moments came to mind and it took me a while to sort of land on, okay, how am I gonna answer this within the context of this conversation? And things like my baptism came to mind. I actually have been baptized twice, once as an infant and then one as an adult. So that gives you an idea of sort of the mixed denominational background that I come from.
Mm,
Grew up in mainline churches and was baptized as an infant. And then later in my life, I was part of the Christian Missionary Alliance at the time, and I ended up having adult baptism. And I love talking about baptism if we ever want to talk about that. So that was important. Meeting my wife, my now wife, and marrying her, that was a big one. Having two kids, very big. And the baptism thing is like representative of, that reality that you have made the life-changing shift to follow Jesus. So all of those are ones that I thought about. But the one that really stuck with me was this. I am the youngest of three boys. And I remember one time, this would have been around grade 7-ish, that I felt like a lot of things were coinciding at that point. I was playing competitive sports. I grew up playing competitive hockey, and I I was an existential kid from the get-go. I remember being conscious of and concerned about death at a very young age.
no, yeah.
Like, I remember being in our family van driving back from Prince George because I grew up in Vanderhoof and like literally crying as a kid because of my consciousness of the fact that we would all die one day and
Mm,
that would be it. I liked life. So on the one hand, I had such a like a typical Canadian upbringing, right? Grow up outside of Prince George in this small town called Vanderhoof. I learned to skate on a frozen river, played
mm,
AAA hockey, all that sort of stuff. And yet there was also this very sensitive, existentially inclined kid. And so those two things were kind of coexisted, but at times produced tension because I liked the sport hockey, but quite honestly, I did not fit in that community at all. A sensitive, artistic kid may like the sport, but doesn't really fit in with this wider community of, tough and yeah, a little bit more thicker skin crowd. So grade 7 comes around, I'm this awkward preteen kid and just trying to find my way in life. And I remember going into the glove box of our family van at the time and looking through cassette tapes to find something to listen to.
mm.
And it's funny, like, my undergrads don't know what cassette tapes are. They thought they were CDs, so I had to explain them, like, "No, no, no, no. Those came before CDs. These were, like, little plastic squares that had magnetic tape and whatever, whatever," and I told them, like, how hard it was to make a playlist, right?
Yeah.
Now you just choose your songs or whatever, but back then you had to wait, for your favorite song to come on the radio, and you had to hit the record thing. Anyway, so I find this clear plastic cassette tape. It was one of those BASF ones that was transparent and then it had like the neon reels in it. It was a mixtape that my middle brother's friend Clayton had made for him. Well, it wasn't a mixtape actually. It was the entire Blink 182 Cheshire Cat album.
Wow.
And I put that on and I look back and at that moment I'm like that tape did something. And of course, a lot of people, Blink-182, it's like, it's pop punk. It's, they write some serious songs, but they're also pretty childish and pretty crass. But when they were singing those songs that were serious, I felt so seen and understood. And
Mm,
when they were singing those songs that were so goofy and offensive, I also like felt as a, 13-year-old so seen and understood in a way that I hadn't before.
mhm.
And so this occurred this is where my answer landed as I was driving into work today, and I put on one of the songs where I was just like, what was it about that moment? I think it was just something outside of me that showed me, hey, this dissonance that you feel, this sensitivity that you feel, this anger that you feel, this goofiness and awkwardness that you feel, you are not alone. And you have people. And that brought me into this world. And honestly, through music, I was brought into the church. And so this one cassette tape sort of set me on this trajectory in that it taught me about music, it taught me how to play music, it helped me figure out who I was and what I was about and how to voice that and I learned, like, pretty much all the songs on that album, and then years later, I got a call to be a worship arts pastor, and then through that, I got into theology, and then through getting into theology, I'm doing what I'm doing now. So, if I were to narrow it all down, I'm like, God put this silly mix tape in that glove box so I could find it and set me on this course. So that's where I landed.
That's
Uh,
awesome. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is amazing the way music taps into our souls, and
yes.
man, there's so much I want to talk to you about today. But a lot of people don't know this about my past. But my mother was a worship leader and played guitar,
Right.
and I have so many rich memories of the way music has touched my life and shaped me too. And she never shied me away from listening to the secular music of the late 80s and early 90s. And, like you, some of those punk rock bands. A lot of people don't know the depth to not only the performers but also their story and their connection to theology, to spirituality, to things that were part of life, and their desire to connect with God or with the divine, I think,
Yeah,
and
totally.
make meaning of what the world is around them.
Yeah, well, that adds context to some of your posts that I've seen, like, you're often posting just photos of records you're listening to,
Oh
and
yeah.
that really adds context to it, and I think it's rightly been said, comedian, podcast host Mark Maron says, "Never underestimate the power of a older person who has good taste in music in your life."
Are you calling me an old person?
No, 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 like, for parents and
Yeah.
siblings. Right?
Yeah.
Like, the amount of people that I talk to who grew up in, conservative Christian homes who weren't allowed to listen to that music because it was worldly, and,
Mm,
what that cut them off from, and
yeah.
n I didn't grow up in a family like that. I grew up in a family with, parents who had good taste in music, and my dad's like, Beach Boys, The Police, right? Sly and the Family Stone, Martha and the Vandellas, uh,
Mhm.
Led Zeppelin, Yes, all that stuff. And as a
Mm,
kid, I was like, "Dad, come on, I don't wanna listen to the band, what's the band?" Like,
yeah.
and then now I look back, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I was so fortunate to have exposure to that stuff when so many of my friends didn't, and now they're playing catch up." But that stuff changes the course of a life. I really believe that. I really do. And so, if you got kids, number 1, it's your duty as a parent to have good taste in music, and number 2, it's your duty as a parent to share it with your kids, you know?
Yeah.
Train them up well.
Yeah. Well, hey, before we get into something serious, what would you think if we had one of our local good churches kind of slip in one of those songs from one of those secular deemed classics, and not announce it or anything, just have lead everybody through worship in it and let them figure out where it all came from.
Well, I mean, if if it's Blink-182, I think whoever's doing it might get excommunicated. But it would be
Oh
fun
man.
while it lasted,
Yeah.
just as a story. It'd be like, yeah, we dropped you know, a a Blink-182 song in there. Like, yeah, that'd be pretty
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah. I think one of the greatest experiences I had of that was when Sylvia Keysmont wrote in her Colossians book. She dropped a Smashing Pumpkins
Hmm.
"World is a Vampire" quote in there. And I thought, "Oh, that's awesome."
Yeah,
Smashing Pumpkins quote in a biblical exegesis.
you
Wow.
gotta do it. I think it's great, and I think one of the problems with academic theology is that, uh, there's it's changing, I think, but there's still this looming idea that there are some sources that are worth taking seriously and others that are not. Who gets to be considered a text worth listening to, entering into conversation with, and who shouldn't. And I always love it when people share those sides of things because you're really seeing the person behind, maybe sometimes the facade of academic speech and writing. And it's all
Hmm.
there. It just may not be in plain sight, right? I say this all the time that, unless you listen to me talking about this, you wouldn't know all of my taste in music and how you form me. But all of the spirit of that, it's there. It's there.
Hmm.
It just maybe isn't in your face as much all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hey, Well Dweller podcast is not only talking about music and life and all the things that make us who we are, which is very important. Um, we also talk about disability and dignity and hope. So let's kind of maybe shift and dive into this idea of disability and how we find meaning and understanding in it. One of the things you and I kind of conversed about a couple weeks ago was the difference or the understanding between visible and invisible disabilities. So, when we When we look at Canada as a whole, statistics are saying about 1 in 4, maybe even more, Canadians are identifying with one or more disabilities. This makes up of about 27% of the population, or roughly 8 million people. Now, of course, that's spread out, of course, over a number of different descriptions within that identity. So maybe if you might want to share a bit how you find meaning and relationship and connection to disability in your life, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to figure out where to start. I'll start from the start because I think it's important to sort of set the scene, as it were. I grew up in a family with a mom who is a counselor and a father who's involved in public education for like 35 years. And one of the things that they gifted to me was opportunities to be in places and be with people who both were like me and like us, like my pretty typical middle class Canadian family, and also people who didn't come from that background. And I look back and it wasn't as if my parents were self-consciously trying to create these opportunities to prove anything to anybody. It was just how my family tried to be. So things that some people might look at and say, "Oh, that's abnormal." That was just kind of normal in my family of like we we create space for people who are and are not like us. And so to
Mm,
concretize this, talking a lot about Vanderhoof in this episode, but like when we were little kids and my parents we moved there from Vancouver, there were two schools in that small town. One was the French immersion school that all the sort of middle to upper class families sent their kids, the French immersion school. And then there was the school that was the public school where more of the working class families went and the kids who were bussed in from the reserve went and kids with disabilities went. And my parents said, "What school do we send our kids to?" And they said, "We're sending them to the public school, because we want our kids to have opportunities to learn that there's a big world out there with lots of people in it and people coming from all different backgrounds. And they just wanted us to be in that world from the start." And I think that set a course for me of like, this is just how we are meant to be. And so that would have been probably like my first, experience of disability. But at the time you're just a kid. You don't Kids maybe notice, but they don't notice in the way that, a mature, and I put that in quotes, adult notices disability, right? Like once you go through this socialization process where you learn to ascribe the word disability to something,
mm,
as a kid, you're like, what did you ever see that? It was a social media thing where like, kids of different ethnic backgrounds and, who move differently, like some who, walk, some who, get around by wheelchair, they're standing beside each other and they're asking like, who's your friend and, what are what's similar between you and what's different? And, it's like, well, we both like Pokemon, right? Or whatever.
yeah.
And then it's like, and what's different is like, well, they like mayonnaise, but I don't. Like whatever it is, but like the point of that piece was to say all the adults are expecting the kids to be like, well, this person gets around by a wheelchair and I don't, right? Or this person has this difference and I, right? But they don't because they're kids, right? So
Mm,
you have to
mm,
be socialized into that. And I think my parents they didn't do everything right. No parent does, but they really tried to like just show us a different way. So I just had friends like I just had friends growing up that, looking back, I'm like, well, they had disabilities, but they're just my pals.
mm,
Um, and so, my first real personal encounter with, you know, I would say being disabled, I identify as somebody who has a chronically disabling condition.
mm,
And this kind of gets us into technical definitions, right?
mhm,
I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease when I was 18, and initially it was manageable. I didn't have a doctor or specialist really sit me down and say, "Hey, this is how bad it can get." I don't know whether that was because it was like professional negligence or they just didn't want to scare the 18-year-old, but either way, they didn't tell me. And probably around 24, 25, I found out how bad it can get. And I'm turning 39 in June, and I've had 20 years to discover how bad it can get having Crohn's disease, which, for those who don't know, it's an autoimmune disease that your white blood cells attack your digestive system, even though there's nothing wrong with it. So, when it's really out of control, you can't digest food, nutrients, like water. So, basically, imagine your absolute worst flu ever on your worst day. And just when it's really bad, it's that all the time every day. And so people are like, "Oh, I know somebody who has IBS or I have IBS and I got to watch, I got to watch what I eat." And like, I like suffering and disease and any of these things, like, conditions. It's not a zero sum game. I don't want to get into like, you know, Crohn's is worse than IBS. Like it's all bad. Like, for reference, like I've been in situations where like if we don't get you into emergency surgery, you might perforate in your digestive system and die. So it's not just like every once in a while I have to like run quicker to the washroom, which is not fun, but it's also like this can kill you when it's really bad. But the reason why I say chronically disabling condition is because I tell people I'm my extroverted, energetic, optimistic self when you see me. If you don't see me for an extended period of time, I am probably laid out, exhausted, or if I kind of disappear from sight and work and social things for a very extended period of time, I'm probably in the hospital and probably really sick. But when I am well and when I'm in remission, like I am right now, I pass as an average guy who doesn't have this condition. So that's why I say chronically disabled condition, because it's invisible until it's not. And then even when it's not, like I'm not necessarily in sight. So this is to gesture to what some people have called the social model of disability, where there are certain realities that people deal with, conditions, particularities, whatever language you want to use there, that will cause the world, people in it, and societal structures to say that's a disability, and then you're in this category.
Mm-hmm.
And usually those are the ones that are visible, right? You can just see that the person that you're looking at doesn't ascribe to the phenotypical human, right? Or just the average human, as if the totally average human exists, right? But then there's somebody like me who passes as not disabled, but then every once in a while, I very much am. So I actually think, we tend to think disabled, non-disabled. And I did a paper on this. I haven't published it, but it's available. I can include it we can include in the show notes if you want. But I actually
That
think
would be
there's a
awesome.
third category of people. I call them people who pass.
Okay.
They're the liminal people who are in this space of they understand what it's like to feel disabled, but because it's a little bit more invisible, they aren't treated in a way, and usually they aren't treated as poorly as people who have more visible disabilities are. So that would be the personal and sort of technical definitions that I would attach to visible and invisible disability, and then also like some personal background on how I ended up in this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know quite a while ago I wrote a series on kind of how we identify disability. And I talked a lot about how there's the descriptive nature of disability, how we describe it in our life, how we describe ourselves, our identity, and the medical diagnosis as well as the ways in which it affects our lives and who we are. But then I also talk about the defended identity of disability. And I think what you're describing is often what people go to. And it's a danger, I think, in the social sense, where if we begin to try to compare one another
Mhm.
within our descriptive realities, right? I think it's important that when we see and build relationships with others, it's okay to share a described sense of who we are in disability. I have certain disabilities, and it is a part of who I am. But it's important not to move it into a defense mechanism of comparing it to other people and where they may be at with their relationship with disability.
Yeah, and that's why I'm so, uh, particular about the language I use because and I say this in the piece, like, I'm not saying chronically disabling condition because I'm ashamed of the term disability. I'm fine using that term to describe myself.
Mhm,
What I'm not fine with is using that term in a way that obscures the fact that because I am able to pass most of my life as not disabled, I get a better deal, you know? And here's the thing, I will use that because if that gets me in the door to a conversation that, someone with a more visible disability, they're shut out of it, I will use my invisibility to do whatever I can to change that. So it's kind of my superpower. It's a way of saying like and it's my responsibility, right? I mean, so yeah, I pass as not disabled most of the time and I'm a guy and I'm white, I'm middle class and I got a PhD.
mm,
I check all the boxes of who gets a seat at the table. Right. But then you have conversation like this, and as my one friend, then you start unchecking those boxes and letting people down. And I'm like, yes, that's what I do. But like all those appearances get me in the door. And then now that I'm in the door, I feel like as a Christian and as somebody who has experienced what it's like to be disabled, that I'm like, I'm not just here for me. I'm here for all of us. And
mm,
I long to see the day when we're all here and I'm gonna, like, push it forward. So, yeah, I'm fine. The Canadian government acknowledges me as disabled. I had to
mm,
make sure that I had the exact right language, like, there's exact right language you have to put in your application to get this status regarding Crohn's disease, and it's gotta be the right words. And so, I was thankful for the specialist who provided that for me. Like, the Canadian government acknowledges me as disabled, but, like, these are more than language games, really, right? And I'm like, I will take the extra support because it is really, really hard sometimes,
mm,
but also like I'm not even going to outsource the naming to the government, you know?
mm,
Like I don't need their validation. It's nice to have that acknowledgement and like support. And also like I think very seriously about these things because some people are like, oh, it's just semantics. I'm like, everything is semantics because semantics shape the way that we see the world and see other people and the way we treat them. So
mm.
words matter, folks. And maybe I overthink this stuff, but this is a huge part of my life and how I think about like what I'm called to do as a Christian and as somebody who is in a position of, minimal influence, but how do you use the influence that you can with the experiences that you do to move the dial a bit on this stuff because it can be really hard for people where it's more visible.
Yeah. My mind is like Swiss cheese sometimes where I got a million different pathways I want to go with my thought patterns. So part of me is saying, I want to explore that idea of
Mm,
how does Jesus model that sense of understanding,
mhm,
right? But the other part that I want to kind of dive into too is going back to the sense of semantics and the way we understand whether a person is disabled or not. You say it's semantics, but I'm wondering if it's not so much semantics, it's that everything is metaphor, a metaphor to open up to relationship, right? So we can create it into the metaphoric experience. But is there such a thing, if it is all just semantics, is there such a thing as a person who is not disabled? I know a friend and I talked quite a bit about this a couple months ago, where he experiences hearing loss and how it affects him in the social environment. And I don't want to, in that defended reality, I don't want to dismiss the significant challenges he faces. But I think that, and maybe you can identify with this as well. When I'm in a crowded public environment or space, finding that wheelchair accessible washroom can be an incredibly dangerous, vulnerable, exposing position for me to be in when it is needed. Whereas someone who has hearing loss, say, um, not so much. It's not that sense of significantly life impacting or challenging. Um, so I kind of wonder, is there such a thing as a person who is not disabled?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that we're sort of circling is this ongoing conversation that at times is really challenging within the whether it's academic discourse, mainstream discourse, or just day-to-day experience and conversation and life is how do you get to a place where you acknowledge, like you see and you acknowledge the particularities of people and you honor those particularities in such a way that if those particularities ask something of you, that you're willing to adjust beyond what maybe you would normally do or what's familiar to you, right? So, a lot of the times with certain particularities, we use the term disability or special needs or diverse abilities. But I think what you're getting at is on the one hand, there are some particularities that if it's a certain context and certain circumstances, the particularity has a more urgent demand or need. And then there are ones that are more ongoing demands or needs, right? You're talking about getting access to a washroom in a social setting and how difficult that can be. And then, a friend who has hearing loss in a noisy room, well, maybe it's not as sort of an acute particularity and need. And yet, if over time this individual is constantly in spaces where he can't enter into a conversation with people in the way that people who don't have hearing loss have, well, the social isolation, alienation, loneliness, depression that can set in when people aren't included in that level of conversation that the other have. Like that's a more chronically difficult situation, and both of those are hard. How do we describe those things in such a way that we acknowledge what somebody is going through, and once we acknowledge it, we show them that we care enough about them to journey with them in order to help them get whatever it is they need in order to feel included or just, you know, very practically have an easy route to the washroom, right? And will we journey with people long enough in order to figure out how to do that and grow deeper in a relationship? I think that is the challenge and the opportunity, to be honest. So, in a way, I want to say, yeah, like we all feel disabled at times. We all feel helpless at times. We all feel shut out at times. And in acknowledging that, I think we also don't want to sort of say, oh, because I have felt lonely or cut out of a conversation or whatever. Like, I struggled once to go to the washroom too when, we were on vacation and I ate that bad food, and boy, it was like it was the worst. You're like,
Mhm.
I get that you're trying to connect with me and I get that you're trying to enter into my experience, via empathy to understand what I'm going through and relate and maybe journey through this with me. But like, there is a certain we have to be careful about just using it as a blanket term because then it kind of just puts a blanket over ongoing, very acute situations that, right? So this is just like how do we use words that acknowledge the realities that people are dealing with and help us enter into a relationship with them so that we can journey with them, um, you know,
Mm.
and not just sort of like either ignore or sort of just paste over, very real needs and very real struggles, right? And I don't think that that conversation will ever be settled until Jesus comes back and we're all in heaven and then he settles it for us. But until then, we continue to have these conversations.
Yeah. Or in resurrected form, and we're all wheeling around in our own wheelchairs.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. We're talking a bit about how we build those relationships and
Mhm.
community. And I think that's a very significant part to the way that we as humans find dignity in ourselves and each other. But I also want to acknowledge that as you said, it's something we will always wrestle with. How do we, or should I say, why do we seem to find it so difficult to find those inclusive community relationships and practices, particularly with those with disability? And I'm going to say, even within the disability community itself. I know you work a lot with people who have cognitive disabilities within your ministry. And I know from my own perspective, at least here in Calgary, I don't travel as much as you do, but I've I've noticed that it seems very difficult to get certain disability communities together in an inclusive movement and activity together. So, from your experience, what's the difficulty there?
Trauma,
Hmm.
isolation. I think one of the things that we're dealing with in North America in general is this rampant individualism and this idea that you become an adult, a mature adult when you grow up and you need people less to the point where you don't need anybody and you're autonomous and you make decisions and you set your goals and you achieve them. And so what that does is create this idea that this is the ideal person, and if we're not striving for it, we should be. And if there's something getting in the way of it, we should fix that about ourselves. Or if it's somebody else, we should help them fix it, or we should move them out of the way if we can't fix it. What that does, I think, is break people up into individual units and at times break them up into individual groups that find those individuals find each other and find themselves in each other and a group forms and then a group mentality can fit in. And then if you add in the logistical challenges of getting outside of your immediate surroundings and interacting with other individuals and groups that you commonly do, what this does is, I think, create a tribal mentality. And um and and it puts groups that, although they have particular things within those groups that make them unique and unlike other groups, there are also universals shared between those groups. And when I say those groups, I mean groups that are pushed to the side or pushed out, right? So, but one of the things that happens in our individualized society, our meritocracy society, is that an austerity mentality weighs in, and it weighs in heavily on everybody. And so what this does is you're looking sideways at the other group and you're like, well, if we, get in, like, great, but if they get in, that means we don't get in, right? And so sometimes that sort of scarcity, competition, judgment mentality can set in, and it's actually in our interest to get together and be like, hey, I acknowledge that you have unique challenges and I have unique challenges too, but actually we have so much more in common than the world maybe would say that we do. And as we come to appreciate the unique challenges that we have, we hear each other's stories and we don't try and say, "Oh yeah, me too." We just listen. And then I share mine. We're like, "Wow, like this isn't." Well, then we start to bridge those groups, and then it's like, wow, now we have strength in numbers, right? So this isn't just disability conversation, like this is the conversation on race. That it seems like, we need to be talking about this, we need to be talking about this, and but we're not talking about that. And so it creates this competition of like who's going to get a seat at the table because there's not enough seats. But as a Christian, I feel like the kingdom of God, like we're told that the kingdom of God is one in which the banquet that God is hosting, everybody's there. And
Yeah.
they can get there if they want to go. And once they get there, it's going to be a cool party. And maybe we'll run into some tension, but like don't let the world tell you that God isn't having that banquet and that we all can't get there, and when we get there that it's not going to go off well, cuz it will. Like it's not going to be perfect, but
Mhm.
like our society tends to work against that. Those intermediate groups looking at that other group that we might sort of have that inherent suspicion of and just be like, I don't see them as an other. I see them as a person and a person I want to get to know and do life with. So, but I think like so much in our world is like pushing against that type of community where we
Oh
don't
yeah.
like, if we're not in competition, we're like steamrolling, you know, everybody's particularities and not hearing them and just letting them be a person, you know,
Yeah.
as they are.
Yeah. I don't know if you did this intentionally or not,
Hmm.
but you talked about how everyone comes into the banquet and sometimes there could be tensions there. And I
Yeah.
think actually, if you want to talk about the theological sense, the banquet is meant also to be reflective of salvation and soteriology, right? Where it's reflective of the kingdom. So you're saying that in entering the kingdom of God now and maybe even in the resurrection, there's tension? That's intriguing. How did you make it here?
Like how did I make it where to this to that sort of.
No, I'm speaking metaphorically. You get
Oh,
into the
okay.
kingdom and you see someone there and you're going, "Geez, how did you make it
Yeah.
into the kingdom?" Right?
Yes.
Definitely. Intriguingly enough, are we recognizing that other person too, and how are we recognizing them?
Yeah. I Can I say something about tension?
Yep.
I think you're right. I mean, I don't think the average church in North America is attuned enough and therefore honest enough about the tensions that inherently come with life, but also with discipleship. I think in North America, we are also obsessed with comfort and we associate discomfort with wrong and to be avoided so often. And sometimes the discomfort and the tension is an indication that there's something wrong and you should avoid it or change it. And sometimes the tension and the discomfort is a good thing because it means you're growing and changing. Because last time I checked, you can't be a disciple if you aren't willing to change. So if change is uncomfortable, to be a disciple requires change and discomfort. And we try and avoid that. And you're right. Like even in the sort of, you know, eschaton, I think they're probably really like, how did you get here? But hopefully at that point, that will be a said with joy and wonder and not judgment, right? And this is the thing that we see the religious folks in the gospels, the powerful religious types having real issues with, is they see people with Jesus that they don't think should be with him and they don't think Jesus should be with them, and they don't get excited and they don't express wonder at how cool it is that the Messiah is hanging out with people of all kinds, even the people that we think he shouldn't.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is just, I don't think the Gospels can be any more clear that when the Messiah shows up, there will typically be that type of tension, and some people celebrate it and express wonder at it and live accordingly, or they fight against it. And I'm trying to figure out what it means to be excited about it and express wonder at it and invite other people into it. But that does inherently have tension because we're
Yeah.
human.
Yeah. And it touches actually on one of my favorite quotes from Gregory of Nyssa, and he says, "Concepts create idols, only wonder grasps anything." And I think that's
Oh,
really the way we should approach any relationship, is with the sense of wonder, right? So that
I'm gonna
I
write that
think
quote down.
okay, that's awesome. And I think another thing that we see within that is the expectation of what I have to do to receive salvation, what I have to do to receive redemption. And, even in that healing pattern, what do I have to do to be healed?
Hmm.
Right. When we enter the kingdom, we say, how did you get here? It's because we had an expectation of that person to fulfill a certain role of discipleship that maybe Jesus didn't have of that person. Um, I love the way you kind of brought your hands together when you're talking about building bridges and they interweave, right?
Hmm.
Because that's one of the things, personally, as a person with a disability, I'm in a wheelchair. I have a spinal cord injury. Um, and yet when I relate to people with cognitive disabilities, I'm in that tension of I want to be in relationship. I want them to be a part of the community, but I also have this deep desire for intellectual stimulation,
Mhm.
intellectual growth and learning, and maybe even to share that with each other. So I know there's been ways that I have maybe experienced it, but maybe I'm going to ask you because I want our listeners to maybe hear how these two different communities can come together and weave together. How has, because I've heard you on your podcast, even you go a little deep for me sometimes, but
Mm.
how how do you navigate those tensions of wanting to be intellectually stimulated while building the relationship with those who maybe are in the sharing and discipling of a wisdom of life as opposed to a knowledge based life?
Yeah. It's funny actually, like, I love conversations like this. I love deep conversations. I love talking about Gregory of Nyssa. I love talking about language and the words we use and don't use and why and all of that sort of stuff. And, in a lot of ways, that actually is I think I was always wired that way, but I think my disability pushed me deeper into it, because
Mm.
one of the things that you deal with when you when you have an autoimmune disease is that, your body is at war with itself.
Oh yeah.
And so in order to get up in the morning and survive, and maybe some days even thrive a little bit, you actually have to stop listening to what your body is telling you. And after a while, you develop this habit of not hearing it at all just so you can get on. So you would so somebody like me retreats further and further into his brain, and I live this very dissociated life where I my wife calls it my mind castle time. Like, I'm happy when I'm in my office and I'm just in my mind castle where I'm just reading. And I'm not cut off from everything below here, but, like, functionally I am.
Mm.
So the joy, but also the real sorrow and risk of that life is, as my one colleague, Lynn Musto, once said, I was in my office doing what I do, and, "Michael, come out for a walk. Come out for a walk. It's a sunny day. Come out for a walk." And I'm like, "Lynn, I can't. I'm reading. I'm in my mind castle." And she goes, "Well, that sounds a lot like a mind prison,
Oh wow.
you know?" And yeah, Lynn's awesome. And, so I tell that story because I'm like, I need people in my life who help get me out of my mind castle, which at times becomes a mind prison. And yes, it's my colleague Lynn, but also it's my friends who they don't seem to care about Gregory of Nyssa or whatever it is that I was reading that day, or whether or not I landed the plane perfectly on, definitions of disability. They just want to be with me physically, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically as a whole person, which may involve a verbal conversation, but it may involve signed communication and I don't sign, or it may just be very, very tactile communication of a hand on a shoulder or a head leaned or even and I write about this in this piece, like a hand clasped over the mouth like this, or a head stuck to a head. And I would say I am still reflecting on what those moments of exchange are. Not even just like physically, spiritually, emotionally, but intellectually. Like those for me too, but it's a different type of intellectual engagement and formation. And in some ways, it far surpasses, the typical academic discourse that is my day job,
Mhm.
talking like I am about this or that theologian, what they said and what it means. I don't think one is more or less stimulating or formative. They're just different. And we need all types. And the gift, I mean, it's not even disability. Like the gift of my kids, they don't care about what I'm writing or not right. They do, but they don't. They just want to play with dad. Like they want to like, when are we going to play, with the mini hockey sticks, or are the Canucks playing? Like they just want to be with me, and that's a gift. And that is a sort of cognitive engagement, but on a totally different level. And I think to be human, we need those, right? And I have to wrestle with, like, if you took away my sort of, if I had a cognitive impairment, would I lose my identity? And if the answer is yes, I have an idolatry problem. Speaking of idolatry,
Mhm.
because my identity is not my grasp of any one particular subject matter. It is deeper than that. It is in my being a creature created by
Mhm.
a creator who loves me whether or not I'm smart or not. You're asking great questions, and when you ask great questions, you make me preach. I'm sorry, I'm talking too long, but that's my answer to it. I think, how do we have communities where everybody gets to contribute, is viewed as somebody who is capable of engagement and change in formation? Even the people that the world would say, oh, I couldn't possibly be intellectually stimulated by them, or I couldn't possibly have my life changed by them, or they couldn't possibly care for me. I'm like, actually, I think they do, and they can, because I've experienced it, and it's amazing, and I hope more people open themselves up to that reality too.
Yeah, I really resonated with your idea of the head castle. I struggled for years of trying to describe what it felt like to be paralyzed and the
Hmm.
language system that I've had to learn to develop since I was 15 years old. And it didn't come to kind of a real solid ground until I heard, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he described it as, I've always felt like a floating head where I have
Right.
floated around. And I never thought much about my paralyzed side.
Yeah.
Everything was up here and everything below just simply was not part of my world. It was, there was a separation that took place.
Right.
But the reality is that just because the lower half of my body is paralyzed doesn't mean that I don't depend on it less for who I am or for my existence in life, for my ability to live for that matter. I need the lungs that I have in my chest. I need the heart. I need the digestive system. I can't not feed it just because I don't feel it.
Right.
Um, and so I think of that in the social sense too, in the metaphor sense. Just because you might not feel another person, identify with that person, doesn't mean you are not just as dependent or interconnected with them to be part of this creation that God has created. So I mean that
You sound
you're
like Paul, the Apostle Paul, in the famous body. I mean, that's what he's on about, right? The famous body passage that everybody likes to use when they're talking about their ecclesiology. That's what Paul's saying. You
yeah.
know, just because you don't think that the kneecap does anything, it's doing something, and it's doing something cool. And ask anybody who's had a knee surgery. Kneecaps do a lot. But if you don't mind me asking, feel free to pass on the question. But like, how is that journey going with 'cause it is your whole self, but the
Mm,
part of yourself that there is a yeah, just a I don't even know what word you would use, but, like, even just the way in which we are our whole bodies talk to our brains, right?
yeah.
And yet we can certain parts of our body, we may not listen to that part. And what does that look like for you? I don't know if you can answer that or want to answer it, but I do wanna create space for it if you're open to sharing about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I go back to something you said earlier where you said there's times where it's like your body's at war with you. I'm paraphrasing, but
Yep.
it's like there's times your body's at war with you. That plays mind tricks on you. It really does. So, life is not always easy. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. The reality is that there are a lot of times in my life where I am deeply fearful and I am trembling. And there's this deep anguish that I'm wrestling with. I feel betrayed by my body. And it's hard not to lash back sometimes, to be totally vulnerable, really hard. And so I think there are times where I succeed. And I think community actually helps me do that. Bonnie really helps me do that. Eric, you need to put yourself in check. You need to realize that your body is doing what it's doing because you're not listening to it at this moment. What's really going on? Look for that, instead of going to that defended sense of why are you doing this to me? It's making my life miserable. Look for the deeper sense of what are you trying to say to me? And how can I put life back into this relationship that I have with with my legs that are beating the snot out of me today?
Mhm.
And maybe that means, like you said, checking out for a few days. I need to get out of my chair for a few days because my legs are saying, no, you need break time. You need to get up and let the blood flow get a little more time in my part of the body.
Mm.
So, yeah, and I think that also takes time. You need to be willing, and speaking in the social sense, when we talk about that paralyzed part of our life that we don't think we are interconnected with or feel, part of the way we learn to communicate with that relationship is to spend time with it, to sit in quiet. You think of Job sitting around the fire with his friends. I think it's significant. And I talked about this in a post I made the other day, that neither God nor Job dismissed what his friends had to say about Job's plight. Both God and Job sat around that fire with them and listened tentatively and openly to them. And they stayed together in that tension of, why is this happening to Job? Why is
Mhm.
this happening to me? And let's wait upon the Lord, if you want to use some of that good old language. It's not, again, I think healing is also part of that question. Part of it is not trying to work it out for ourselves, but rather waiting for God to show that mercy, that grace, that revelation of what he or the body or that part of life is trying to communicate to you.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think in that story, things really start to go wrong when people start saying too much, and presuming what the deal is and what the answer to the question why is, as compared to, like, the best thing that Job's friends did in that story was just show up and sit there and wait until Job opened his mouth,
Mhm.
and gave space to not talk about something, but feel something that their friend was going through and give him the space to feel it until he was ready to vocalize it, which for somebody who spends a lot of his life talking is always a challenge and encouragement for me.
Uh, yeah. So we're talking a bit about hope here, I think.
Mm.
What is the language of hope in a life with disability? Um, we've touched on it, but spirituality, faith. I like to draw a distinction between spirituality and religion. I think they're both important and part of our life. There's no such thing as I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, and there's no such thing as I'm religious and not spiritual.
Hmm.
But how do those language and practices of hope, help you in your life or guide you in your life?
Hmm. I, uh I think a lot about hope for a number of reasons. One of the scholars that I engage with a lot, Jacques Ellul, wrote a lot about hope. In a book that he wrote called Hope in Time of Abandonment, he said, "Oh, in that triad of faith, hope, and love, all of those are important. And of course, love is the one that never fades away. But in different eras, he says, there may be different emphases that are needed." So he talks about the Reformation and Luther's emphasis on faith. Like that was a prophetic proclamation of justification by faith, through grace. But he said in our time, it seems to him that hope is what is needed because, and I mean, he's writing in a post World War II, so post Holocaust, post, dropping of the atomic bombs, um, Cold War, all of that, political instability, social instability, and everything that comes with it. That people need hope, and if that's the case, what do we say hope is? And once we say something that is convincing about it, how do we find it? How do we get it? And Elul says at one point in the book that his short working definition of hope is our response to the silence of God. And um, what I think he means there is that hope can work its way out in a lot of different ways. There's the type of hope where you're like, well, I hope I passed my test, or I hope when I leave the house today that it's sunny, or I hope that I don't get run over by a bus crossing the street. But then there's a deeper, more tangible hope that is, what do you have when everything that you hoped in is taken away?
Hmm.
What comes after that? When all the things that you hoped in and thought were going to deliver comfort, safety, certainty, peace, all that, when those things are taken away, what do you have? Do you have any hope beyond those hopes? Or do you have despair? And he would say the hope of God, the hope of Christ, is what comes after. That it is the presence of a God who appears to be silent, appears to be absent, but nevertheless has shown, in not just in word but in deed, even when it feels like I am not there and I'm silent and I'm not doing something, I am here, I am with you, and I am doing something. And it may take some time for you to see that. And in that time of waiting is when the real hope, really emerges. And I think that's consistent with what Paul says. Like, faith is hope in things unseen. If you see it, if you have it, and you can hold it, is that hope? No, it's experience that either confirms or denies the hope that you have. So it's an anticipation, and I just supervise a student's project on hope. And he talks about it as a practice and a habit of leaning and longing toward God,
Hmm.
um, whatever your circumstances, good or bad. So, um, and I think people need that today because I mean, there's so many things that people are putting their hopes in here or there, but they don't deliver. They're not delivering. Only God, I think, really delivers on the hope thing. Crucifixion. I mean, how hopeless does it get after the crucifixion when you thought that this was the guy,
Hmm.
and then you see him executed after being tortured? And it's not just, the political powers that are doing it, it's the people who are part of your own religion that said that they were waiting for this guy. And now he's dead. I mean, you know, in that despair and trauma, like they forget that he said this was going to happen and he was going to raise again. But in those moments of despair, it's like what comes after that is resurrection. But you have to pass through that moment of despair and longing in order to get
Mm,
there. So, yeah.
yeah, and I think hope is big enough to allow for those moments
Yeah.
of despair. Despair is part of hope, I think. You're describing after the death on the cross, the 2 on the road to Emmaus, right?
Mm.
It's
I was
over.
just writing, I was just reading and writing about that before we started talking.
Yeah,
Imagine that.
yeah. So they were lost so much in despair and the loss of Jesus and the vision that they thought was coming for them,
Yeah.
that even Jesus is walking beside them and they don't even recognize him in that moment.
Yeah.
And yet he remained with them. He
Yeah.
remained with them. He entered the home with them. He broke bread with them. And it's in the breaking of the body and of the blood, in the Eucharist, in the communion experience, that they find that revelation of hope. I think that's cool.
Yeah, it is. I mean, just so you know that I'm not lying. I mean, I'm reading about this right here, and just what you said. It's Serene Jones's book, Trauma and Grace, and she says on the Road to Emmaus commentary, we need to remember that as we seek to minister in a world too full of violence, we do not need to make God appear, for God is here already. Our task then is to proclaim God's presence, and that's
Mm,
within the context of the Road to Emmaus experience. They're too disoriented and too fearful and too traumatized to notice that he's there, but he's always already there.
mm.
And in telling them the story of, Moses onwards and breaking that bread, sooner or later they're able to see it and hear and like, oh, he's here. And then we go and tell people what we've experienced. And hopefully they see it too and experience it too.
Yeah. You also mentioned leaning in and longing, right?
Hmm.
And the image that came to my mind was from my theology professor, Gary Lapine, from years ago, talking about the 16th chapel scene of God outstretched towards Adam, and Adam with his hand. And if you pay attention to the hands, Adam's hand is very limp and relaxed. He's not really trying. Whereas God is the one who's outstretched, reaching for that longing for connection with humanity.
Oh, that's good.
And interestingly enough, in history, they've done whatever technology they use, but previous drawings and preparations that Michelangelo did for that scene, he actually had a reverse where Adam was the one outstretched and God was the limp one reaching. But when he put the finished product, he reversed it. And you have to wonder why. God is truly the one who remains present. Like you said, Jesus is the one who remains despite the 2 not feeling the desperation, not feeling the loss and not really recognizing him. And, and yet if we just, if we can turn that over, become the one who's also leaning in, the
Yeah.
connections that can really be made with God.
Yeah, God, I mean, this is Ephesians, right? You talk about working out your salvation in fear and trembling, for God works in you for his good pleasure, and he's prepared all of it beforehand, but he's holding it out, and we receive. Reception is an action. I mean, this is Luther, right?
Mm,
Passive righteousness, passivity is not like you don't do anything. Reception is an action. And so there is some agency and will involved there. But the only way that it becomes possible for us to receive anything is prior action of God. So he's straining towards us. Are we straining towards him? Right.
yeah.
I think you're totally right there. And yeah, that'd be a great, series of images. That'll preach, Eric. You should do a presentation on that or something, or a sermon or something.
Oh, maybe one day. I think this is perfect place to maybe kind of tie off our conversation. But before we do, I want to give the opportunity for you to share with our listeners some of the great things that you're involved with and working towards in future, as well as I know you have your own podcast on Substack, Personalist Manifesto. If you want to talk a bit about that, that would be really cool. But yeah, how can our listeners get to stay in the conversation with you?
Thank you. Yeah, so Personalist Manifestos is a Substack I started just at the end of last year, and I just tell people it's theology talk radio. It's kind of built around or inspired by Jacques Ellul, this thinker I was talking about, but there's also a lot of conversations adjacent to his work. So we have conversations like this about disability. It's just, yeah, wide ranging theologically inclined conversations. The school that I'm at also offers micro courses in various things like political theology, violence in the Old Testament. We're doing a course on Trinitarian theology of worship, offering actually a course on disability in the church. Start here. So, where to
Mm,
start when you don't know where to start. And it's a team taught thing, all coming from different perspectives. The final thing I would mention is a group that is, there are folks who are involved in deeper communion that are also part of this group called the Lazarus Center, which is a new thing, and it's just the LazarusCenter.org, and really it's trying to come alongside churches within the Canadian Pacific. I mean, we'll come alongside anybody, but within our particular location, Canadian Pacific Northwest, just helping churches. See, hear, engage, and start living out the sorts of stuff that you and I are talking about here.
mm.
And you can follow me on Blue Sky. It's just MCHL Morelli at Blue Sky. Um, I'm on Twitter, but I'm not. I made the exodus to Blue Sky, and I feel like Blue Sky is bluer sky. So those are some things that you can, yeah, do to see what I'm up to. Yeah, lots on the go.
Very cool. I hear you. I won't lie. I'm on that fence of thinking I'm tired of Twitter too. I'm tired of getting Elon Musk's and Donald Trump's tweets thrown at me when I didn't
Yeah,
ask
yeah.
for them.
Well, the best thing is like if you go on Blue Sky and we follow each other and you post something, the chances of me seeing what you post are a lot higher. That's the real fresh thing. It's like it used to be on Twitter that would happen, whereas now it's like finding stuff that my friends post is like trying to find a needle in a very toxic large haystack. Whereas like on Blue Sky, it's like we follow each other. I don't have to go searching too far. It's just there. So
Yeah,
by the
that's
way, that's
awesome.
not a paid advertisement. This is totally yeah, it's unpaid. I'm not a influencer for Blue Sky.
And neither am I. I'm not receiving any benefits from them either.
But if they want to give us money, we'll take it.
Absolutely. We're here. Hey, Blue Sky,
Yeah.
find Michael Morelli and myself will
We'll
gladly
take your
accept
money.
any funds. Michael, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of your story
Yeah.
with us, and I hope I can have you back on the well sometime. Also, one last thing, if you might send me some of those links for what you're up to, I'd love to include them in the
Yeah.
show notes for our listeners. So,
I will
thank you.
do. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I'm always happy to talk. So I'll have a chat anytime.
Awesome.